on social cognition, the social brains group at Unisinos. And our second speaker, I want to welcome our second speaker, Vivian Bohl, philosopher of cognition, who will talk about, well, as I said earlier, she has a fellowship positions at the University of Tartu in Estonia and also at the University of Bochum in Germany. I want to welcome Vivian Bohl. She's going to give a talk on relational models theory and mind reading.
Okay, so hello everybody. I encourage you to come a bit closer because my voice is not very strong, so if you can't hear me, just come closer. Yes, and I want to thank John for inviting me. It's amazing to be in Brazil. I've never been here before. It's such a beautiful country. So I'm really excited to be here and also looking forward to the rest of the workshop. So is it okay when I sit down? Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. So I'm going to talk about relational models and mind reading. And I want to start out with just, as we all know, humans are extremely social beings and we are extremely interdependent. So we depend upon other people a lot, which means that social cognition is absolutely crucial to almost every aspect of our lives. And we can ask, what are the basic cognitive processes that enable people to understand and to interact with each other? And this is the question at the heart of research of social cognition. This is the main question that researchers ask when they study how social cognition works. And we've just heard one answer to this question. So we've heard a wonderful introduction by Alan Fisk to the relational models theory, which says that people use 4 fundamental cognitive models: communal sharing, authority ranking, equality matching, and market pricing, to generate, understand, evaluate, and coordinate almost any aspect of social behavior in almost any domain across cultures. However, since 1980s, many cognitive psychologists and philosophers, and more recently neuroscientists, have given a very different answer to this question. And also today, many researchers believe that the most basic, the most fundamental ability upon which people rely when they socially coordinate is so-called mind reading, or also called theory of mind, or philosophers sometimes call it folk psychology. So it is the ability to attribute mental states like emotions, beliefs, desires, intentions, and so on to oneself and others, and to use these attributions to predict and explain other people's behavior. This brings me to a kind of a chicken or egg question. So which ability is more basic? Is it relational cognition or is it mind reading? And more importantly, how are these two types of social cognition related? So this will be the question of my talk today. And here's the outline of the talk. So I was told that not everybody in the room will be familiar with what mind reading is and the theories of mind reading. So in the first part of the talk, I'll just tell you a little bit about mind reading, about the false belief task, which is a crucial test for figuring out whether a child or an animal is able to mind read. I'll talk a little bit about the development of mind reading and just a little bit about the main theories of mind reading as well. And then I go on in the second part of my talk to tackle this chicken and egg question. And I look at this question on 3 levels. I look at it on the level of phylogeny, like which one is more crucial, which one came first in evolution. I look at it on the level of ontogeny, that is in childhood development. And I also look at this question on the level of mature social cognition. Once both abilities are there and fully developed, which one is more basic and how do they relate? And if I still have some time left, then I will also talk about the function of sophisticated mind reading. But we'll see when we get there whether I still have enough time. So what is mind reading? As humans, we are not just physical creatures. We also have minds. And how we behave largely depends not only upon what the world is like, but upon what we take the world to be like, upon what we believe, what we desire, what we intend, and so on. In other words, we have all sorts of mental states that guide our behavior. And what is remarkable about us as humans is that not only do we have minds, but we are able to understand that also other people have minds and different mental states, and we are able to attribute mental states to others to predict and explain their behavior. So in other words, we are mind readers. And since 1980s, there has been a lot of research on the development and on the neural and cognitive underpinnings of mind reading. So it's by now one of the most studied social cognitive abilities, which doesn't mean that we know everything about it, but we know quite a bit. And I want to start by referring back to this paper by Premack and Woodruff from 1978. So this is the paper that kind of kick-started this huge research on mind reading. So Premack and Woodruff are two primatologists, and they published a paper, Does the Chimpanzee Have a Theory of Mind, in 1978. And the paper reports a series of experiments with a chimpanzee called Sarah. Sarah is on the picture. And they wanted to find out whether a chimpanzee, can attribute mental states to conspecifics or humans. And what they did, they showed Sarah videos of a human actor trying to get bananas that were in different unreachable locations. And before the actor actually solved the problem, the video was put on hold, and Sarah was given a pair of photographs. And only one photograph depicted a solution to the problem. So in this case, for example, in the video, the actor was reaching for bananas that were attached to the ceiling, but they were too high up. And then on one of the photographs, there was the solution to the problem, the actor standing on a box and actually getting the bananas. And the authors of this paper argued that this shows that Sarah expressed her understanding of the actor's intentions. Now, whether these experiments actually show that or not is controversial. We can also find other kinds of explanations to this ability. But this paper really caught the attention of many philosophers and psychologists. And philosophers and psychologists started to ask, well, we don't know whether chimpanzees have a theory of mind, but we also don't know what the theory of mind of humans is like and how it develops. So why don't we study it? And several philosophers argued that in order to have a theory of mind, or in order to be a mind reader, one must be able to represent the beliefs of others, and that one can test whether a creature has this mind-reading ability by examining whether one understands that people can represent the world differently from the way it really is. Like in this slide, so this girl sees the apple, but she's able to understand that someone else can be mistaken and represent the apple as an orange, for example. So there are two representations in her mind at the same time, what I represent and what I take the other person to represent. And one typical version of the task that was later called the false belief task is depicted here. It's the Sally Ann task. So children are shown the following scene. I think I need to use this one. Right. So this is Sally, and this is Anne. And Sally puts her ball in the basket and leaves. And while she's away, Anne takes the ball from the basket and puts it in the box and leaves as well. And then Sally comes back, and the child is asked, where will Sally look for her ball? And what was found was that children who are 3 years old or younger, they typically say that Sally will look for her ball in the box, because that's where it is. That's where they know it is. And they are not quite able to understand that someone else can have a false belief about how the world is like. However, children of 5 years of age and older, they give the correct answer. They will say that Sally will look into the basket because that's where she falsely believes the ball to be. So there seems to be a radical shift in children's understanding of the mind that appears somewhere between 3 and 5 years of age. The false belief task has also been applied to populations with developmental disorders and populations with different cultural backgrounds. And Baron Cohen and colleagues tested normal children, high-functioning autistic children, and children with Down syndrome. And they were all on the same comparable mental age. And what they found was that children, normal children and children with Down syndrome, most of them, I think they were about 5 years of age, they are able to pass the false belief task, whereas the majority of autistic children failed in the task. And what is interesting about this study is that children who had autism, they were high-functioning autistic children, their intelligence was on the same level with the normal children, whereas the children with Down syndrome, they were developmentally retarded. Their IQ was much lower. And this suggests that mind reading is not directly dependent on general intelligence, because children with Down syndrome were able to pass the task, whereas autistics were not. And it also suggests that mind reading and social relationships are linked, because we know that one of the symptoms of autism is the failure to develop and sustain normal and fulfilling social relationships. So we can also ask, how is it in different cultures? Is mind reading universal? Well, the study of Wellman and colleagues, it's a meta-study which involves almost 200 different papers. It revealed that the country of children's origin does influence performance, so that in any particular age, children from different countries perform better or worse than each other. For example, children in Australia and Canada perform better than children in the US, and worse than children in Japan or whatever. And however, it was found that children in all countries demonstrated more or less the same developmental sequence, which suggests that culture does influence the speed of the development, but not, I mean, it suggests that the developmental trajectory of mind reading or false belief understanding is pretty universal across cultures. So what is this developmental trajectory? So I'll tell you a little bit about how mind reading develops. And I put together a little table where I mention some of the most important landmarks of mind reading development. And we can look at the first period from birth to about 18 months of age. And from birth, infants show more interest towards social than non-social stimuli. So babies are usually very interested in people and less interested in non-social entities. And already newborns imitate certain facial expressions of their caregivers. So this suggests that there is some kind of cross-modal matching between the infant's proprioceptive how they perceive their own bodies and how they perceive the bodies of other people. Newborns discriminate between animate and inanimate entities, so they distinguish objects that are characterized by self-propelled movement, and they are more interested in animate than inanimate objects. And by 2 months of age, infants engage in genuine dyadic interaction, so they start to interact by smiling and vocalizing, and this is sometimes also called proto-conversations. And in around 9 months of age, something really important emerges, which is called joint attention and triadic interaction. So this means that while children from birth are able to interact face-to-face with another person, but from 9 months of age, they begin to coordinate their attention with another person's attention, and they understand that I can focus on an object and you also focus on the same object, so we can interact not just directly, but about things in the world. And this is also the age where infants begin to engage in social referencing. This means that in ambiguous situations where the infant doesn't know how to react to a certain stimuli, the infant will look at the caregiver, typically the mother, and depending on what kind of emotion the mother expresses, the infant will either, go on curiously investigating the object or back off. So the infant will respond according to the emotional reaction of the caregiver. And now, what has been found quite recently, and this is a rather puzzling result, is that 15-month-olds also pass something that has been labeled nonverbal false belief task. So before that, everybody believed that infants are able to understand false beliefs only when they're 4 or 5 years of age. But I'll explain what this means. So first about the method. So we cannot ask infants who are just 15 months old about, we cannot ask them to tell us whether they understand false beliefs. So we have to use other methods to figure out what goes on in their mind. And what we do know is that infants look longer at surprising compared to non-surprising stimuli. And we can use this information to design experiments. And this was exactly the method that was used for this study. So it's a study by Onishi and by Largeon. And they showed infants the typical false belief scenario. So here's a person putting an object into one of the boxes, and then the agent leaves, and someone else comes and transfers the object from one box to the other, and then the first agent comes back and reaches either into this or the other box. And what was found was that infants are surprised when the person reaches towards the box where the object now actually is, and the infants are not surprised. They spend much less time looking when the person reaches towards the box, so that it seems like she's acting on the basis of one's false belief. So we're not quite sure how to interpret this data. However, I want to introduce some distinctions I've borrowed from José Luis Bermúdez, a philosopher, and he distinguishes between minimal mind reading and substantive mind reading. And by minimal mind reading, he means the sort of mind reading that occurs when a creature's behavior co-varies with the psychological states of another participant in social exchanges. But this kind of mind reading does not actually require representing the psychological states of others. So it can be that creatures use some behavioral cues or heuristics that enable them to coordinate their behavior with the psychological states of the other, but they don't actually represent those states. So it's mind reading in a very minimal sense. And substantive mind reading occurs when a creature's behavior is systematically dependent on its representations of the psychological states of other participants in the interaction. So substantive mind reading is what is usually meant by mind reading. It actually involves representations of mental states. And now we can also distinguish two kinds of substantive mind reading. So Bermudez talks about perceptual mind reading, and this is what we have when an individual represents a particular individual as perceiving a particular object or state of affairs. However, it doesn't involve representations of propositional attitudes. So in order to have this kind of mind reading, usually what's going on is that I see another agent and I see an object, and I just have to postulate some kind of relation between the agent and the object to say that the agent perceives the object. So both are in my perceptual field as well. Whereas propositional attitude mind reading is much more complex. So it involves representing a particular individual as being in a particular propositional attitude towards a towards a particular proposition. So there's an individual, and there is a mental relationship to something that the individual cannot see, a proposition. So it's much more complex in that sense. And what is important is that in the case of perceptual mind reading, so perceptual states are usually, they have direct implications for what the animal or the agent is doing. So it's pretty, when I see what a person or an agent perceives, I don't have to represent much more information in order to make predictions. So when there's an agent and there's an object, and I attribute a desire or a goal to the agent to get that object, this is all I need to predict the behavior, to predict that the agent will go and get that object. Whereas in the case of propositional attitudes never cause behavior just by themselves, because propositional attitudes work in concert, and there are all sorts of inferential complex relationships between propositional attitudes. And in order to use propositional attitude mind reading for behavior prediction, one needs to be able to not just represent the propositional attitude, but also to represent the whole psychological background profile of the creature and the relations between that propositional attitude and the background. Right. So to sum up, we can talk about three different ways to mind read. So minimal mind reading is actually not really mind reading. It's just correlation between the mental states of one agent and the behavior of the other agent. Whereas substantive mind reading has two forms. So one is perceptual mind reading, which involves representation of simple mental states like perceptions and goals as relations between the agent and some object or the state of affairs in the environment. Whereas propositional attitude mind reading involves representation of propositional attitudes and also complex relations between different kinds of propositional attitudes. So just to refer back to the study about 15-month-old infants seemingly solving the false belief task. So this is really puzzling because we get this result just by using the looking time paradigm, but we still find that children are not able to explicitly or verbally solve the false belief task until they are about 4 or 5 years old. So we don't really know how to explain this data. And different authors explain it in different ways. So some think that this is really just minimal mind reading, that there are somehow correlations between the mental state of the person and the reaction of the infant, but the infant doesn't really represent any mental states. Others think that there are actually two different cognitive systems for mind reading, that there's an early developing mind reading system, and this taps on this kind of system, but it's implicit, so one cannot explicitly report that. And that there's another explicit mind reading system that develops or comes online later on. Okay. But let's go on with the development. And by 18 months, important changes emerge in the development. And this is where children start to show explicit awareness of the subjective nature of experience. They begin to distinguish between real and mental events. So they distinguish between objects and thoughts about objects. They start to engage in pretend play. So a child can engage in a play pretending that a banana is a telephone, which is actually quite a complex thing to do, because it means that the child has two different representations of the same object. So the child represents the banana as the banana, but also the banana as a telephone, and is able to manipulate these two different representations. And by 18 months, children also understand that other people can have desires that are different from my own desires. And I would actually like to show a little video to exemplify this. So the person who will be speaking is Alison Gopnik. She's a famous developmental psychologist, has done a lot of work on the development of mind reading. So let me see if I can get this one to work.
The question of how early children start to understand that other people think differently.
Alison Gopnik of the University of California at Berkeley and her colleagues.
Can you hear?
In one study, 14 and 18-month-old children come into the lab and are presented 2 bowls.
What's wrong?
Here. Windows B.
Ah, okay.
Okay.
Okay, I'll start again. So,
The question of
just have to make the screen bigger. Here we go.
how early children start to understand that other people think differently than they do is at the heart of a series of experiments conducted by Alison Gopnik of the University of California at Berkeley and her colleagues. In one study, 14 and 18-month-old children come into the lab and are presented 2 bowls, one with broccoli in it and one with crackers. Dr. Gopnik takes a taste of each of the foods.
Oh, yuck! I tasted the crackers. I don't like crackers. Ooh. Broccoli. I like broccoli.
She clearly prefers the broccoli. To see if the child understands what she prefers, Dr. Gopnik puts out her hand and asks,
Could you give me some? You give me what I like. But... And what we discovered was that 18-month-olds would give me the broccoli if I acted as if I liked the broccoli.
even though they probably prefer the crackers themselves.
So even these very, very little children already seem to have realized, okay, this is a strange person, she likes broccoli, but if that's what she likes, then that's what I'm going to give her. And that's a really amazing thing for children this young to know.
Thank you.
The 14-month-olds were not like that. The 14-month-olds would just always give me the crackers, whether I liked the crackers or the broccoli.
Could you give me some and then I'll have some? Oh, thank you.
All right. Okay, so this ability emerges at around 18 months of age, and by 3 years, children are able to do quite complex reasoning based on what they know about other people's desires. So they know, for example, that a person is unhappy when her desire is not fulfilled, and happy when this desire is fulfilled. And they can use information about people's desires to coordinate with others. Yeah. And they also use mental state terms, so they begin to understand how to use words like believing, desiring, thinking, deciding. So they're still learning, but they're becoming pretty good at using these terms. And in around 4 or 5 years of age, as you already know, explicit understanding of false beliefs emerges. So children begin to understand and produce deception. They can deliberately try to make others believe something that is not the case. And they also distinguish between appearance and reality. So, for example, children are shown a piece of painted sponge that looks like a rock, and once they squeeze the sponge and realize it's not a stone, it's a sponge, 3-year-olds would say that it is a sponge and it looks like a sponge, whereas 4 or 5-year-olds understand that appearance can be misleading, that something can look like one object but actually be another object. Children understand different aspects of knowledge acquisition, so they realize that information comes from different sources. So I can know something because I've seen it, but I can also know something because someone else has told me, and they can use this information to coordinate with others. And from around 6 years of age, children also begin to understand recursive mental states. So not just that another person has a belief, but that another person can have a belief about what another person believes, and so on. So second order and third order mind reading. So in sum, we can distinguish 4 periods in the development of mind reading. So we can call the first period from birth to 18 months social perception. And in the second year of life, mental state awareness arises. But the ability to meta-represent mental states or propositional attitudes first appears in around 4 or 5 years of age. And it takes another year or two until children acquire the ability to understand recursive or embedded mental states. And now I want to briefly go back to where all this mind-reading research started, to chimpanzees. And in these almost 40 years that have passed in between, there's been a lot of research on the mind-reading abilities of chimpanzees. And what we know by now is that chimpanzees are sensitive to simple perceptual and volitional states, and they can use this information to coordinate with others, or sometimes also to deceive others or to hide things from others. But it's unclear whether they actually represent mental categories or whether this sensitivity to other individuals' mental states is based on some non-mentalistic categories or on associative learning or something that's really just behavioral. And different authors interpret things differently. For example, Michael Tomasello argues that chimpanzees do represent some mental states, like goals and intentions and perceptions. Other authors like Daniel Povinelli and Cecilia Hayes argue that all what we see in experiments and in how chimpanzees behave in the wild can be explained non-mentalistically. So the question whether chimpanzees are just minimal mind readers or perceptual mind readers is still open. But in any case, we do know that chimpanzees fail to understand false beliefs. So it seems that they are not capable of propositional attitude mind reading. So this more complex form of mind reading seems to be unique to humans. So this is as much as I wanted to tell you about the development of mind reading. Before I go on, do you have any clarificatory questions? Or you can also lead them to the end, but just to make sure we're on the same page. All right. So now I want to tell you a little bit about theories of mind reading. So we know a lot about what children are able to do in different ages, but we can also ask how do they do that, and how does mind reading actually work? And there are different theories to explain that. And most of the theories fall into the category of either a theory or simulation theory, or some hybrid that combines elements of both. And I tell you a little bit about each. So theory takes seriously the idea that mind reading is based on something that is very similar to scientific theories. And when we think about what scientific theories are, so they have several features. They are abstract in the sense that the vocabulary of the theoretical constructs differs from the vocabulary of the evidence on which the theory is based. Theories explain regularities in the data in terms of some causal structure. They entail ontological commitments by postulating what exists and how it exists, by generating counterfactual claims. And most importantly, theories enable us to predict and explain phenomena. And also theories are dynamic, which means that they change over time under the pressure of new counter-evidence. So theory says that all or most of these features also characterize mind reading. So theory has two versions. The first one is the so-called child as scientist theory, and it's based on the idea that children naturally seek to construct intuitive theories that enable them to explain and predict their environment, including social environment. And theory understands concepts of mental states as abstract theoretical postulates that people use to explain and predict observable behavior of others. And children's ability to mind read is thought to develop via a process of theory construction and change, which is analogous or very similar to construction and change in scientific reasoning. And this version of theory seems to suggest that mind reading relies heavily on domain general reasoning. Whereas the other version of theory argues that mind reading is more of a domain-specific ability and not directly related to general intelligence. Here, mental state concepts are still understood as theoretical postulates, but the development of mind reading is explained by reference to a maturation of an innate cognitive module. And according to this view, mind reading relies on a domain-specific neural or cognitive mechanism that is possibly cognitively encapsulated from domain general reasoning. Now, in contrast to theory, there is simulation theory, and simulation theory argues that people don't need a theory to understand others. What they need is the ability to use their own mind to simulate the mental processes of others. So this means that we can mentally put ourselves in the other people's shoes, and according to simulation theory, mental state concepts are thought to derive from children's own direct experience, from their own mental states. And it is thought that we are introspectively aware of our own mental states, and we can use this to understand other people's mental states by a process of simulation. Right. And, well, in the early days of theory and simulation theory, there was a huge discussion, like which one is correct. But now most authors agree that when we mind read, we probably do a little bit of both. So we need to have some kind of theoretical information, but we often also use simulation. So now most authors have gone hybrid one way or another and combine elements of theory and simulation theory. There are still differences in whether either theory or simulation is taken to be more important. But yeah, now we find theories that combine different elements. Okay, and this is what I wanted to tell you about mind reading as such. So unless you have clarificatory questions about this part, I want to go on with the second part of the talk, which is the chicken and egg question, as I framed it. The question of which ability is more basic, relational models or mind reading? And we can ask this question on 3 levels. So about what comes first in evolution, what comes first in child development, and how do these two social cognitive abilities relate in mature social cognition. Most researchers of social relationships think that in order to have a relationship, some form of interdependence or complementarity between the behavior of the partners of the relationship needs to be present. And Alan has also written about this, and he says that complementarity, some form of which is basic in all social relationships, means that the actions, thoughts, and affects of 2 or more participants are each oriented to the other person's actions, thoughts, and affects in such a way that they make sense only in conjunction with each other. So when we assume that relationship involve complementarity on some level, it kind of makes sense to think that mind reading is necessary, or at least very useful, for social relationships. Because in order to orient my actions, thoughts, or affects with your thoughts, affects, and actions, it's useful to know, first of all, what those thoughts, affects, and actions of yours are. And this is what many researchers in social cognition research actually assume. So it's a common assumption that mind reading in some sense comes first, or is at least very fundamental for social relationships. And we can find all sorts of claims about this. When you read any paper about mind reading, it usually starts by statements like, attribution of mental states is to humans as echolocation is to the bat, or that mind reading and the capacity to negotiate the social world are not the same thing, but the former seems to be necessary for the latter, or that mind reading makes possible the rich social dynamics that pervade human life. However, the assumption that mind reading comes first has several problems, and I'll point out some of them. So first of all, mind reading is usually studied outside social relational contexts. Research in mind reading is based on lab experiments, such as false belief tasks, and these experiments are specifically designed to elicit mind reading. But they do not tell us much about when and for what purposes people mind read in real life. So we need to critically analyze the role of mind reading in social cognition. And I want to do that by first looking at the phylogeny of social cognition. And when we look at other species, we see that many other social species live highly sophisticated social lives. They often coordinate very precisely, apparently without any ability to read minds. So it seems that mind reading surely is not necessary for all kinds of social coordination. But perhaps it has become fundamental for the human species and our relatives. So it makes sense to look at how it works in primates, our closest relatives. And what we see in primates is that they are among the most social of animals, and they form various types of social relationships. Communal sharing relationships are ubiquitous in primates. They distinguish their kin from non-kin and show more pro-social behavior towards kin. We find linear dominance hierarchies very common in primates. And in many species, we also find alliances based on reciprocity. However, we can ask, well, they do have these different kinds of relationships, but does it mean that they rely on relational models? Do they actually represent something like communal sharing, authority ranking, and so on? One of Alan's colleagues, Nick Haslam, argues that relationships in the form of communal sharing, authority ranking, and equality matching are very likely to be present in most primates. So he argues that relational cognition in humans is likely to be phylogenetically continuous with relational cognition in our evolutionary ancestors. However, relational models are highly abstract cognitive representations, and it's possible that primate relational cognition that looks very much like what we do as humans actually relies on some other less abstract cognitive mechanisms. And I think that one way to investigate whether non-human primates represent relational models is to look at not only whether primates form social relationships, but whether they are able to understand relationships between other conspecifics to whom they are themselves not related to. And I will present some evidence in support of the view that primates indeed seem to be capable of doing something more abstract than just behavioral matching, or that they seem to have rather abstract ways of representing certain types of social relationships. So let's look at communal sharing first. So as I said, all non-human primates distinguish between kin and non-kin, and they show more communal sharing-like behavior towards kin. However, do they understand communal sharing relationships between conspecifics to whom they are themselves not related to? So there are some evidence that they do, and there's a nice study on vervet monkeys, which shows that vervet monkey mothers respond more strongly than other females to the scream of their juveniles, which is what we expect. But other females, when a juvenile is crying or screaming, they respond by looking at the mother of this particular juvenile, as if they're expecting or understanding that there is some kind of relationship between these two. Well, we cannot rule out that vervet monkeys have simply learned to associate screams of a particular juvenile with this behavioral responses of the mother. So we do need more research on this. But at least this suggests that it is possible that primates may represent something like communal sharing in a more abstract way. Now let's look at authority ranking. So dominance hierarchies are also very common in many species, and they are ubiquitous in primates. However, primates appear to be unique in their capacity to make transitive inferences, by virtue of which they can infer the relative position of their peers. So for example, when a new baboon is introduced to the group, it doesn't have to fight with everybody in the group to figure out the relationship with all members of the group. So let's say it fights with a particular member of the group and loses, and the baboon is able to understand that if I'm not able to beat person A, and I see that person A is subordinate to agent B, then I'm not going to even try to fight with agent B, because it's obvious that I will lose to that guy as well. So it means that primates are able to make transitive inferences that if I'm below B and B is below A, then I'm also below A. Now, when we look at equality matching, there seems to be something reciprocal going on in many interactions in primates. So primates exchange grooming and support and food and sometimes sex. However, it's not clear what the underlying cognitive mechanisms are. But let's see whether there's any evidence that they might represent something like equality matching. So we find that male baboons form alliances with one another to overpower younger, higher-ranking rivals. And these alliances appear to be based on reciprocity because males tend to repeatedly solicit aid from the same partners, and they alternate roles of helper and receiver of help. However, this in itself is not a very strong evidence that baboons have an abstract understanding of reciprocity. So perhaps the best evidence comes from chimpanzees. So what we find in chimpanzees is something that some primatologists call a revenge system, which means that chimpanzees tend to intervene against individuals who intervene against themselves. So if I'm a chimpanzee and you're a chimpanzee, and if I help someone else to fight against you, then the next time somebody's fighting against me, you will help that agent. So it seems like it's a pretty complex ability, which implies an understanding of something like equality matching. Now, how about market pricing? So what I was talking about so far was just exchanging support for support, or grooming for grooming, or giving food to someone and getting food from someone. But we also see exchanges of grooming for support, or food for grooming, or like different kinds of things get exchanged. For example, in vervet monkeys, prior grooming significantly increases one's willingness to attend to the solicitation of support from the groomer. However, this only applies when the agents are not matrilinear kin. So if A and B are relatives, then the magnitude of one's response to the solicitation of help is not affected by recent grooming. So, which means that in communal sharing, it doesn't matter whether you groom me or not, I'll help you anyway. But when there's no communal sharing, it does matter. And for example, in West African chimpanzees, we find pretty complex ways of exchanging different favors. So they exchange grooming for grooming, support for support, but also support for meat and meat for sex. So it seems like these are pretty different things, so perhaps this is something like market pricing. However, I'm not aware of any evidence that chimpanzees understand proportionality. So there's no evidence that they trade a small piece of meat for a small favor and a big piece of meat for a big favor or something like that. So the question of whether there's something like market pricing going on is still open. If you know any evidence that would support one way or the other what we know, whether there is something like market pricing in primates, then we're happy to hear about it. But I couldn't find anything. And now just to go back to what I said about mind reading in primates. So chimpanzees are sensitive to simple perceptual volitional states, but we don't know whether this is a case of minimal mind reading or perceptual mind reading. And we do know that chimpanzees or other primates, they do not understand propositional attitudes. So from this we can conclude, well, non-human primates are minimal mind readers at least, and they do form various kinds of social relationships. And it seems that non-human primates probably cognitively represent some relational models. So maybe not quite the way we do it, but it seems to be rather abstract. And chimpanzees may be capable of simple perceptual mind reading. There is no evidence of propositional attitude mind reading, as I said. Well, to put all this together, it seems that cognitive models of communal sharing, authority ranking, and perhaps equality matching have probably emerged earlier in phylogeny, in evolution, than propositional attitude mind reading. So all these researchers who think that propositional attitude mind reading is really fundamental, well, at least in phylogeny, we do not find that. Now we can look at the same question on the level of ontogeny. So does mind reading emerge earlier than relational models or vice versa? So there is not very much research on the development of relational models, like when and how do children start to represent relational models. But there are some studies, and I want to tell you about 3 studies which suggest that an understanding of some of the relational models emerges fairly early in development. So this is one study, I don't know how well you can see, where infants were shown cartoons with social agents, so these geometrical figures with eyes. And the experiment began with the 2 groups of agents taking turns in dancing together. So these lines here represent the patterns of moving. And we know that similar appearance and eyes and synchronic movement are cues to a communal sharing relationship. So after they were shown this cartoon, the figures moved towards the sides of the screen and started performing individual actions. And the 2 red circles, one after another, they circled around one of the boxes, let's say the blue box, and landed on it and left the scene. And then the yellow ones also performed actions individually. Say they circled around the purple box and landed on it and leave. And then there was just one red and one yellow agent left on the screen. And this was the test phase. So the last of the social group either did the same thing that the first 2 agents of the group had been doing, or did a different thing. And what was found that infants looked significantly longer, or they were surprised to see inconsistent trials when the agent performed a different action from what the first 2 members of the group were performing. However, this effect went away when the movements of the figures well, everything was the same, except for the agents didn't have eyes, so they weren't perceived as social agents. So which says that it's not just that infants prefer particular ways of geometrical figures moving in the screen, but they understand something about social relationships, and they expect by 7 months of age members of a communal sharing group to act alike. Another study I want to tell you about is a study with 10-month-olds, which shows that 10-month-olds, but not 8-month-olds, use relative body size to predict the outcome of a dominance contest. So infants, what was done in the study was that infants were shown 2 agents, 2 blocks with an eye and a mouth, moving across the screen. And they met in the middle of the screen, and then one of the agents bows at the other and scoots away and gives way to the other agent, who continues its way across the screen. So it looks like there's a dominance relationship, and what was found was that infants of 10 months are surprised when the larger agent bows to the smaller agent and scoots away, but they are not surprised when the smaller agent bows to the larger agent. Right. And the third study I want to tell you about is with 15-month-olds. And this study suggests that infants represent social dominance in a rather abstract manner, which allows them to generalize their expectations from one situation to another. So here, let me see if I can, I don't know how to, so it's supposed to be a video on the screen, but anyway, I can just explain what was going on. So, in this study, in the familiarization phase, first there was one agent who went inside this box, seemed to like being inside this box, and then another agent came from the other side, let's say a blue circle, and pushed the red agent out of the box. Did it several times. So it seems like there was a dominance contest between these 2 agents, and one of the agents was the dominant one. And then it was time for the test video, and then in this video the same agents appeared, but they did something different. So they collected these little white objects, and so there was the object in the middle, and the agents came from both sides, and it was always one of the agents who got to get the ball and take it away. And what was found was that children were surprised if the dominance relationship had changed from one cartoon to the other. So it seems like they expected the dominance relationship to stay stable across different interactions. So this study indicates that infants recognize and memorize who prevailed when 2 individuals had conflicting goals, and they used this information to predict the outcome of future interactions. So expecting the dominance relation to carry over from one situation to another. So unfortunately, I haven't come across studies on early understanding of equality matching or market pricing, but we can already use what we learned from these studies and to try to put these results to the context of development of social cognition. And what we see is that a rather abstract understanding of communal sharing and authority ranking emerges in the very first period of social cognition development. And it emerges before we can talk about explicit awareness of mental states, not to mention propositional attitude understanding. So, to conclude, infants appear to represent communal sharing and authority ranking relationships in a somewhat abstract way before they are able to represent propositional attitudes. It also seems that early understanding of authority ranking co-emerges with early understanding of goal-directed actions. So when we go back to this table, so around 9 months of age, children begin to discriminate goals from movements, and around 10 months of age, at least according to these studies, they are able to use relative body size to predict the outcome of dominance contests, and they seem to have a rather abstract representation of social dominance that they can use in different situations. So perhaps this is, we find this because of how these studies were designed. So perhaps there are other ways to test an understanding of authority ranking. But yeah, based on these studies, this is the picture we have at the moment. So I can only say that we need to do more research on the development of relational cognition to map how exactly it develops and how it maps onto what else we know about the development of social cognition. And finally, I can go on with the chicken and egg question on the level of mature social cognition. So it is possible that even if relational models are evolutionarily and developmentally prior to mind reading, that once both abilities are fully developed, mind reading becomes the main strategy for understanding others. At least this is what many researchers seem to still believe. However, there are good reasons to doubt that mind reading can function as a basic tool or as a tool that we use most of the time to socially coordinate with others. So for example, Morton argues that mind reading is too complex to enable to solve coordination problems in most everyday contexts. And that's because in order to predict what you will do, I would have to take into account not only what you think you will do, but also what you think I think you will do, and so on and so forth. So we would be extremely ineffective if we were to rely on propositional attitude mind reading for social coordination. Another problem is what is called the problem of holism. As I explained before, propositional attitudes never cause behavior on their own. So what causes behavior is complex ways of how propositional attitudes relate to each other. And how a person behaves is compatible with almost any propositional attitude, given some constellation of other propositional attitudes. So there's this very difficult problem for all the theories of mind reading. How does a person actually decide what background information is important to predict a behavior of an individual? And there's also the problem of computational intractability, which, I mean, if mind reading just one person is so complex already, there would be just a combinatorial explosion if we were to mind read several people at the same time. So if propositional attitude mind reading is too ineffective to serve as the basis of social coordination, why do we do it? What's the function of it? How I'm doing with time?
It's 7 minutes after 6. So
Okay, so I can talk about this as well. So I don't have time to spell out the whole background of why I'm arguing what I'm arguing But I think that mind reading primarily serves relational purposes. I think mind reading, this complex propositional attitude mind reading, may help us to monitor and shape complex social relationships, particularly when it is not clear what kind of relation we are dealing with, when interaction becomes problematic or is both important and uncertain in outcome. So for example, when I meet someone and this person is particularly friendly towards me, I may start to wonder, is she a true friend, or is she friendly just because she wants my money or connections or whatever? We're not sure what's going on. Another context where propositional attitude mind reading is likely to be important is when we wish to change the form of the current relationship or some aspects of it, or when we apprehend that the other partner has such a wish. So the classical example of, when I suspect that my partner wants to break up with me, I start to ruminate about, what does my partner want from this relationship? Is he unhappy? Why is he unhappy? And so on. But it also can happen in less important relationships, when we're just we know what the relationship has been so far, but there's something strange going on, so we wonder what the other person wants and how does the other person want to change the relationship, or we are ourselves have some motivation to change the format of the relationship. The third context where I think mind reading becomes rather important is when we have meta-relational concerns. It means that this happens in contexts where it is important to keep track of how one relationship influences another relationship. So this is when we reason about how participants or third parties apprehend and evaluate a particular episode of a relationship in order to anticipate how a current relationship influences and is influenced by other relationships. So for example, let's say I have a good friend whom I haven't seen for a long time, and he has married in between, and I meet this person and I start to wonder, can I still act the same way as I did before? Because, maybe when I compliment my friend or when I give him a hug, his spouse will become jealous. So this is also likely to be a context where we want to know what's going on in the minds of others and how they apprehend relationships. And the fourth context where I think mind reading is important, especially in cultures where making moral judgments entails taking into account whether an act was carried out intentionally or not, and other aspects of mental states. I think mind reading is likely to be especially salient in ambiguous moral contexts. So in cases where we are likely to ask, did she do it by accident, or did she do it intentionally? Did she realize what would happen if she did this or didn't do that? So to put it differently, I think mind reading, this more sophisticated propositional attitude mind reading, is likely to facilitate relationship reading and to do it on several levels. So mind reading may help us to figure out which relational models shall we use. So in a certain meeting, when we doubt whether this is intended as strictly a business meeting or a meeting of good colleagues, so is it a market pricing or an equality matching kind of a relationship? It can help us to figure out how to implement a certain relational model. So when I do know that, I have a authority ranking relationship with my boss, but what does it really mean? Does he or she expect me to just follow her instructions, or does she expect me to initiate new projects myself? So This is one example where we may want to reason about the other person's mental states. Also in cases where we want to figure out what is the current dynamic status of the relationship. So let's say we're in a sports team and we're supposed to take turns, but we may ask, like, does the other team realize that it's their turn right now, and do they really understand the relationship and the current status of the relationship in the same way we do? And finally, mind reading is likely to help us keep track of where is this relationship going and how shall we develop it. So how is the other person attempting to manipulate it, and how shall I counter that? So yeah. Right, and I almost forgot the fifth context, which I also talked about before. So this is cases where where it is important to figure out how does one relationship depend on other relationships, and what are the entailments of the other relationship for the first one, and so on and so forth. So to sum up the whole talk, I've been talking about relational models in phylogeny, and it seems that development, long before children understand false beliefs or are able to attribute propositional attitudes. And sophisticated mind reading may serve relational purposes, so it may help us to monitor and shape complex social relationships, particularly in moments of uncertainty, in situations where one or both partners wish to change the relationship, in meta-relational contexts, and in ambiguous moral contexts. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Vivian.
Do you want to come in front?
No, I don't need to. No, it's okay. From here. I think he will change. Você me filma, né? He can film here. Okay, I just wish to make some comments and maybe one or two questions you need. Okay. So in Brazil, there are psychiatrists and psychologists working with tests in the theory of mind, and they are starting now to translate it to Portuguese and so on in Brazil, to sometimes to apply to mental disorders, but sometimes not. So they are starting to do that right now. And we are in our lab starting to replicate some tests with false belief tests, but we are at the beginning of it. It is very interesting what you said about babies. We were reading Susan Carey's book on where she mentions many of these experiments with babies, so as to try to figure out which dispositions we are innate or which not, and how to differentiate innate disposition from cultural or acquired disposition in infants. But so far I understand the issues are in development, so we don't have really established answers to which dispositions are really innate and which not. It is very interesting what you mentioned about minimal mind reading. So minimal mind reading, at some point you said it's not really mind reading. So my first question would be, why not? Why is minimal mind reading not really mind reading? You made this difference between reading using propositional attitudes and not using propositional attitudes. But at the same time, in philosophy of language, there is this question if we really can identify propositions. So in the sense that maybe what we call proposition could be called something else, or could be called, in a very general sense, a kind of representation, but maybe not a structure one, not a linguistic structure one. So we don't really know if we really read beliefs that are linguistically structured. So I don't know if you have something to comment about it, because I myself have many doubts, and as Aquinian, yes, and reading some new developments in cognitive sciences and so on, and in embodied cognition theories, I wonder if really we use so much structured beliefs and structured representations as philosophers used to think. So I think you maybe agree with that, because yes, your conclusion is that in evolution we should take propositional attitudes as something that comes after a former social development, formal social skills. So, but what would you say? Do you think we really use so much reading beliefs in a structured way? Do you think that's right? And maybe you have some experiments that you could mention that could prove that we really read propositional beliefs or something like that.
Very good question. So I completely agree that what many philosophers and also psychologists have assumed about mind reading, that we do it all the time, that we do it across social contexts, that we don't really have any evidence that this is the case, because we haven't actually studied it. So it's for the past 30 or 40 years, this is what people have simply assumed to be without actually studying it. And I think there are good reasons to think that we do not do propositional attitude mind reading constantly. So I think we are able to do it, but the question of when exactly and for what purposes we do it, ultimately it requires an empirical answer. And, well, I've written a paper where I argue for what I, in a brief form, try to argue in the end of the talk, that we do propositional attitudes mind reading or a more complex kind of mind reading in certain relational contexts where we're not quite sure what kind of relationship we are having, or where the other person or myself wants to change the format of the relationship. And there's some kind of coordination problem that we need to solve, and we cannot solve it by more simple heuristics or strategies. So I think then we are likely to kind of move one level up and switch to this more complex reasoning about mental states. And well, I think one way to study it, which I've also argued for in a paper that came out last year, one method to use would be experience sampling. So this is just to explain very simply. We give people beepers or smartphones or whatever that, and they carry them along all the time, let's say for a week, and they receive signals at random moments in their lives. So whatever they do, they receive a beep, and then they are asked to report on a screen to answer a few questions about, what was the last thought that I had before I heard the beep, what was my emotional state, and what was the situation like. And when we gather a lot of data from different people about this, we can look at in what contexts people are actually attributing mental states. So the assumption is it's not a perfect method, but it would be one way to kind of get closer to what is actually going on in people's minds. And there is one study that has already used this method to study mind reading. It came out, I think, in 2013 by Briant and colleagues. So they used experience sampling to see how often people attribute mental states in comparison to behavioral states and just random thoughts. And they did find that people think more often in terms of behavior or action, but there is also quite a lot of mind reading going on. What they also found that people more often attribute mental states to themselves than to other people. However, I think we can use this method and to see whether there are some contexts in which people are specifically likely to mind read. And this can tell us something about what the function of mind reading really is, when do we do it, why do we do it. So perhaps there are other better or different methods to study that, but so basically what I'm saying is that we don't actually know how much people do propositional attitude mind reading, and we should study it. We shouldn't just assume that this is what we do all the time, as many people have assumed so far.
Yeah, so far I understand is presupposed that when I say mind reading, I am speaking about beliefs and propositional attitude. So I agree that the tests show that also, but maybe in the future this will change, because maybe if you incorporate some principles or some criticism from embodied cognition theories, etc., you could still speak about mind reading, but maybe more similar to what you called minimal mind reading.
Right.
Don't you think? Maybe.
So at the moment I'm quite open.
More behavior.
Yeah. I think we need to do more research to figure out what is actually going on. But I'm aware of people coming from the tradition of embodied and embedded and extended cognition, and they usually argue that, so whereas people who study theory of mind or mind reading assume that we mind read all the time, there's another group of philosophers who argue that we hardly ever mind read, that we can explain almost everything about social cognition without mind reading. I tend to be somewhere in the middle. I think that, everybody agrees that we do have this remarkable capacity to think about other people's mental states. And I think it's it's unlikely that this capacity has evolved, that we have it and we hardly ever use it. I think we do use it, but I think we need to do more research to figure out when and for what purposes we actually use it. And I think that the answer will have a lot to do with social relational contexts. Because as humans we are very motivated to relate to other people. The quality of social relationships tells us a lot about, it enables us to predict the health and the happiness and a lot of important aspects of people's lives. So social relationships are really important, and I think to start or to kickstart this more empirical research on why we actually mind read it, we may want to take into account this very social nature of ours, that mostly when people think about other people's mental states, they are interested in some aspect of the social relationship they have with this person.
The relationship between mind reading and empathy.
Well, it depends on what kind of mind reading you have in mind and what do you mean by empathy, because there are different ways to understand what empathy is.
The mirror neurons, the way we connect with people.
Okay. Yeah, well, in my research I've tried to use the concept of empathy as little as possible, because I think people use this word a lot, but they often mean different things, and at the moment I'm not sure what empathy really is. Well, we can talk about mirror neurons, which is, well, I'm sure most of you know, these are the neurons that light up when, let's say, I do a certain action and when another person does the same action. So it seems like there's this biological direct connection between what I do and what other people do. So when we just talk about mirror neurons, then to go to the theories of mind reading, it's usually the simulation theorists who rely on research on mirror neurons, because when mirror neurons were first discovered, the simulation theorists like Alvin Goldman, they right away started to argue that this proves that we are right, that there is a neural mechanism that enables us to simulate the mental states of others, that we do not need to theorize. But we also know that mirror neurons are not the whole story. We also know that monkeys have mirror neurons, and as I've just explained, primates are not able to do this more sophisticated mind reading. So it's not quite clear what the relationship between mirror neurons and mind reading is. It seems to be a part of the mechanism that they may help us to understand other minds, but there's something more going on.
Mm-hmm. If I can add very briefly, we know that Rizzolatti discovered mirror neurons in macaques, and macaques are about the least empathic animal on the face of the earth. They are not nice to each other. They don't show any sign of caring about others' suffering. So, that's kind of interesting in its own right.
Maybe they're sadists. They leave something and they like it. Yeah.
So usually when people talk about empathy, one can distinguish between cognitive empathy, which is kind of like mind reading, just understanding other people's mental states, and affective empathy, which is the ability to feel what the other person is feeling. And they might rely on very different mechanisms. So also in this sense, just talking about empathy can be confusing because we don't know unless we specify what we actually mean by empathy, we can talk about very different things.
And in the tradition, which has been studied here in our graduate program, in many theses, people are writing about moral empathy.
Right.
So it's linked to being good or being social in a good sense. No? And not just sense, and not just be able to predict behavior or thoughts, but also to behave in a positive sense socially. So
Right.
many theses are about that here in Unisinos. Just to clarify. Sometimes they are thinking about what Hume said on sympathy when they speak about empathy, but also some are writing also starting to write about primate social behavior. So and how mirror neurons work in that. So, but that's starting right now, I think. So
That sounds exciting.
we had a thesis defend this week that mentioned wolves also. You had a picture, and some are sustaining that wolves are very similar to us in the moral sense or something like that, but I don't know.
Yeah, well, I think I forgot to mention that, well, the standard understanding of why we mind read is we mind read to predict and explain other people's behavior. Well, I think it's there's something more going on. So the view is taken over from theory, which assumes that when we mind read, we do more or less what scientists do when they explain and predict the world. However, this model is taken from understanding the non-social environment. So we want to, predict the weather or understand how some entity in the physical world behaves. But in the social context, it's not just that I'm an observer and try to explain and predict another person as if it was just another object in the world. There's also the dimension of being aware that the other person also perceives me, and there's a mutual interaction between me and other social beings, which is not the case in a non-social environment. So I think that we have different strategies to explain and predict other people's behavior, but we are not just predicting and explaining. When we mind read, we also try to adjust our own behavior to be in accordance with the social situation. So depending on what I believe about how you perceive the situation, I want to adjust my own behavior. So if I want you to like me, I want to figure out what kind of people you like, and I try to behave in a way that that is in accordance with what I think you like, or depending what kind of motivation I have, what kind of relationship I want to have with the other person. It's not just about predicting and explaining, it's also about adjusting my own behavior. So I think it's a crucial difference from, well, it's important to keep this in mind when we talk about mind reading, that it's not just similar to what scientists do. Yeah, Alan?
One strong possibility, it seems to me, might be that mind reading, the capacity for mind reading and the inclination to do it evolves to make social relationships work better. So one example in a more competitive framework is you can play chess if you only know the rules of the game. You don't need to mind read at all. You can just play chess, right? And to some degree, I think that's what most chess programs do or used to do. They just knew the rules of the game, and you could play chess without any mind reading, right? Now notice that you can't play chess with only mind reading without knowing any rules. That just won't work. But if you play chess without any mind reading, you're not very good, because what you want to do is try to figure out what is the other person trying to do. How can I defend myself? How can I make moves that they won't recognize, what I'm up to, and catch them and trap them and that sort of thing. Now that's a competitive thing, but the same applies even more in a cooperative kind of situation. How can I, if they're intending this, how can I help them, but if they're attempting this or hoping for that, so all the kinds of issues of trust and cooperation depend on some kind of mind reading, and so mind reading really is a tremendous facilitator, makes you much better at social relationships. So one argument could be that it evolves, once we're relating, if you have the capacity to mind read, you can relate much better.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's what I've been trying to argue for. Yeah.
So, just Daniel Dennett will say we act as if we could read the minds, but we aren't really reading minds. We are attributing propositional attitudes, but we can't be sure they are really happening. So I don't know which would be really the difference, but I think in Wittgenstein's second period, philosophy of mind, philosophy of language, he would say that we act as if we could read, but we are never really sure we are doing this. So the reference isn't really, and maybe it's not really important that we are, that we know what's happening in other people's minds. What would you say? Is it important to know that it's happening, or just to attribute?
Yeah, so it's a question of whether mind reading is an epistemic thing, whether it gives us knowledge about what's going on in other minds.
Okay. Yeah.
So I think some people believe that it is an epistemic tool, but it depends on what your view on minds and mental states are. I mean, if you don't believe that mental states really exist, that it's just a way of describing things, then. But I think we're definitely. So, I think I'm rather a realist about mental states. I think that mental states, in some sense, exist, and they do causally influence our behavior. So if we take this view, I still think that we get mind reading wrong, that it's difficult to figure out what's going on. However, the practice of mind reading still has an important influence on social interaction. And often, well, at least in some cases, mind reading works as a self-fulfilling prophecy. So let's think that, well, I think that you are angry at me. You're not, actually, but I think you are. And this influences the way I interact towards you, which may actually cause you to be angry at me. So it's like mind reading comes first, and the mental state that I attribute to you comes later. So this is one way mind reading may work. So I think, yeah, that it's an interesting question on its own, whether how much we can actually, how accurate we are in mind reading. I think that there's a paper that came out recently. Yeah, I can't even remember the author right now, but it argues that we are actually more accurate than many people think in mind reading, but I don't I haven't read the paper carefully yet, so I don't know how they actually studied that. But often we do get the mental states of others wrong. Well, there are interesting studies on mind reading during conflicts in marital couples. So in one of these studies, married couples were invited to a lab, and they were supposed to have a discussion about something they don't agree upon. So they had a disagreement. They were discussing it for, say, 20 minutes, and then both of the partners were taken to a separate room, and they were shown the video of the interaction, and the video was put on hold in every 20 seconds or so, and they were asked to report what was going on in their minds while they were having this argument with their spouse. And it turned out that people do quite a lot of mind reading, and the more serious the conflict is, the more people tend to attribute negative mental states to others, like negative intentions, and he or she doesn't really want to cooperate with me. And so it seems like the nature of mind reading and the nature of the social interaction, or how serious the conflict is, are related. And another interesting thing that came out was that there are gender differences, that women tend to think more about their partner's mental states, whereas men tend to think about their own mental states. There's also a discrepancy between what they actually attend to, like men focus more on the actual subject of the disagreement, whereas women monitor the implications for the relationship. Like they do also focus on the subject, but they also monitor the way the partner interacts and make inferences about what does this tell us about the relationship. And so the more the ways people mind read go apart, the more serious the conflict is. So it seems that in some sense accuracy is important. So it's important to be on the same page, more or less, to get along well. We don't know whether conflicts cause people to mind read in a certain way, or whether mind reading in a certain way cause conflict. I think it's probably a feedback loop, that it starts somewhere, and then the mind reading becomes more negative, which makes the conflict more serious, and so on and so forth. Yes.
What is the influence of the moral judgment when I'm making this mind reading? How can I get rid of this bias? Have any? Can you take this apart in your experiment?
What do you mean by moral judgment?
For example, I have my beliefs, and I will probably try to predict what you're thinking based on my beliefs and my judgments. Is there an influence?
Yes. So one example would be, probably you're familiar with the Nobi effect, which is, so we tend to think that we attribute intentions to others, so that intention comes before action, that a person has a good or a bad intention, and then one acts upon that intention. But what Nobi found out in his studies was that attribution of intentions depends on the moral context. So people were given a story of, I think it was an entrepreneur who was carrying out one's business, and while doing that, either caused harmful or beneficial influence on the environment. And then people were asked, so let's say that one had bad influence on the environment, and people were asked, did this businessman or entrepreneur intentionally cause harm to the environment? And when there was harm done, then people were likely to attribute intention of harming the environment to the person. Whereas when it seems to have been just a beneficial side effect. So the I don't know, the entrepreneur wanted to sell something, but also accidentally, or it seems that he also had good influence on the environment. And people were asked, did he intentionally help the environment? And people were likely to say no, it wasn't intentional. So it seems like what we attribute to others in terms of mental states depends on the moral context and how we interpret what is good and bad. I don't know how to get rid of it. It's just that I'm more interested in how social cognition actually works. So there are all sorts of biases, and the context is really important. In some contexts we attribute certain mental states and we don't do it in other contexts. Yeah.
So let's see. Sua participação. Nós vamos continuar amanhã de manhã, às 10h30.